In the year 1539, England stood at a delicate crossroads. King Henry VIII, now middle-aged and weary, was once again alone. His beloved Jane Seymour, the only wife who had given him a male heir, had died shortly after childbirth. Though Henry publicly mourned her, privately his court whispered that the king would not remain single for long. The realm needed stability, and alliances were as valuable as love, perhaps even more so for a monarch like Henry. Europe was divided between Catholic and Protestant powers, and Henry, after breaking away from the Pope, needed friends on the Protestant side. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, saw an opportunity. He suggested a political marriage to one of the sisters of the Duke of Cleves, a powerful Protestant ruler in Germany. The match would strengthen England's position against both Spain and France, who had been growing increasingly hostile. Henry, intrigued by the idea, agreed to consider it. But there was one problem. He had never seen Anne of Cleves. In an age before photography, appearances mattered deeply, and portraits were the only windows into distant courts. The king, known for his vanity and his strong opinions on beauty, insisted on seeing her likeness first. To capture this potential bride, Henry sent for his trusted painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, one of the finest artists of his time. Holbein had already painted many noble figures of Europe, and knew the dangerous balance between honesty and flattery when it came to royal portraits. Cromwell gave Holbein clear instructions: travel to Cleves, paint the lady with accuracy, but make her appealing. Holbein arrived at the German court, where Anne greeted him with modesty and dignity. She was not known for glamour or courtly grace, but she had a quiet charm, gentle eyes, fair skin, and a calm expression that spoke of virtue and humility. Holbein set to work, sketching her with great care. When he returned to England, he unveiled the portrait before the king. The king gazed upon it for a long time. The image before him was elegant, refined, and serene. Anne seemed to possess both beauty and innocence, a perfect balance that appealed to his aging heart. "She is fair and gentle," Henry murmured, perhaps more to himself than to anyone else. For a moment, the king imagined her as a companion who could soothe his temper and bring peace to his restless soul. He saw not just a queen, but a symbol of renewal, the chance to rebuild his happiness and his kingdom's strength at once. Cromwell's plan seemed to have worked flawlessly. Henry became eager, even impatient, to meet the woman from the portrait. Letters were exchanged, preparations made, and the English court buzzed with excitement. The king's courtiers spoke in whispers of a grand union that would secure England's future. What none of them knew, however, was that this painted promise would soon shatter into one of the most awkward and disappointing encounters in royal history, the moment when fantasy met reality, and the portrait's perfection betrayed the king who trusted it.
The winter of 1540 was bitterly cold, but England was alive with anticipation. News had spread that the new queen-to-be, Anne of Cleves, was finally on her way. After months of preparation, the long-awaited meeting between Henry VIII and his future bride was about to happen. The king himself was restless, pacing through his palace, filled with a mix of excitement and nerves. He had fallen for her image. That graceful face painted by Holbein had stirred in him a youthful spark he thought long extinguished. Now he wanted to see her, not as a ruler greeting a foreign princess, but as a man meeting his beloved. True to his impulsive nature, Henry decided that their first encounter should be romantic, even theatrical. He would disguise himself as a common man, sneak into her chambers, and surprise her with a gallant kiss. He imagined a fairy tale moment, a scene out of a courtly romance, where she would instantly recognize him, not by crown or robe, but by the power of love itself. Those around him, including his wary courtiers, dared not question the king's plan. Henry was certain this meeting would seal their affection before the wedding. Anne, meanwhile, had just arrived at Rochester Castle after a long and tiring journey from Germany. England was strange to her. the language unfamiliar, the customs peculiar. She had been raised in a modest, serious court, where education focused more on duty and piety than on music, dance, or flirtation. Still, she was curious and hopeful. She had heard tales of Henry's power and charm, though she knew little of his tempestuous past. Her ladies helped her dress elegantly for her first days in England, unaware that the king himself was on his way, unannounced. When Henry entered her room, dressed plainly and masked in his little disguise, he was thrilled with the drama of it. He approached Anne boldly, expecting her to blush with delight. Instead, she looked confused, even alarmed, as a stranger strode in and tried to embrace her. When he revealed his identity, she seemed more startled than impressed. She dropped into a polite curtsy, but her expression was distant, uncertain. Henry's pride, as fragile as it was grand, cracked instantly. He had expected adoration. He received awkward courtesy. He stepped back, studying her face, searching for the beauty he had seen in the portrait. The resemblance was faint. The painting had been kinder than reality. Her features, while gentle, lacked the allure he had imagined. To him she seemed ordinary, plain even, dull. Worse, she did not seem charmed by him at all. He left the meeting pale and silent, muttering bitterly under his breath, "I like her not." The fairy tale he had built in his mind crumbled that day. The courtiers who accompanied him sensed the shift in the air. A king who once longed for love now felt betrayed by a portrait, by his minister Cromwell, and perhaps even by fate itself. What was meant to be a moment of passion turned into one of disappointment, and it would shape the downfall of both a marriage and a minister.
The morning of January 6, 1540, dawned gray and tense over Greenwich Palace. It should have been a day of triumph, a royal wedding uniting England and the Duchy of Cleves in a powerful alliance. But behind the glittering banners and the echo of church bells, an uneasy silence hung in the air. Henry VIII, once the most confident man in Europe, felt none of his usual excitement. He was about to marry a woman he did not desire, bound by political necessity rather than affection. The image of Anne's calm, unremarkable face haunted him more than it pleased him. Yet, to back out now would mean diplomatic humiliation and chaos for his kingdom. So, with heavy steps and a forced smile, the king prepared for his fourth marriage. Anne of Cleves, for her part, approached the day with quiet composure. She knew little of the language or customs, but she understood the importance of her role. Her purpose was to bring peace and unity, not romance. Dressed in rich velvet and jewels gifted by the king himself, she looked every inch a queen. Her demeanor was gentle, her eyes kind, but her heart uncertain. The grand ceremony began with all the splendor England could offer. The Archbishop of Canterbury presiding, nobles in brilliant attire, and courtiers watching closely for signs of harmony between the royal pair. Henry stood beside Anne, his expression stiff, almost lifeless. When he took her hand, his fingers were cold. Those close enough to see noticed how he avoided her gaze. There were no smiles, no warmth, just a mechanical exchange of vows. The people cheered as the marriage was proclaimed, unaware of the disappointment buried beneath the king's regal posture. To them, it was a day of celebration. To Henry, it was the sealing of a mistake he already regretted. That night, as custom required, the couple retired to their chamber. The court waited eagerly for signs of joy, expecting news of a successful union by morning. But when Henry emerged at dawn, his face was drawn and grim. To his advisers, he confessed what everyone feared. "She is kind, but I can do nothing with her." The king's pride had suffered a second blow. He claimed he found her body repellent, that there was nothing in her to move him. Whether this was truth or an excuse, only Henry knew.
The story spread quickly through the palace, whispered by servants, speculated by nobles, and analyzed by ministers desperate to protect their positions. Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the match, began to feel the cold shadow of the king's anger fall upon him. The marriage, unconsummated and joyless, became a political embarrassment. Yet Anne, oblivious to the growing storm, continued to treat the king with gentle respect. She smiled when he visited her, unaware that every encounter only deepened his frustration. By the end of that month, everyone in court could see that the union was doomed. What began as a hopeful alliance had turned into a silent war of politeness and pretense, a loveless bond trapped by duty, and a king humiliated by his own disillusionment.
By the summer of 1540, the uneasy peace within Henry's marriage had reached its breaking point. The court was tense. Whispers filled the corridors, and everyone knew the king was deeply dissatisfied. Henry could not bear the sight of his new queen for long. Every polite conversation, every formal meal between them felt strained. To his closest confidants, he repeated the same words, "My heart cannot to her." He blamed Cromwell for deceiving him with false promises and a flattering portrait. What had begun as a diplomatic triumph now felt like a personal humiliation, and Henry, a man driven by pride, could not forgive that. Thomas Cromwell, once the most powerful man in England, realized his position was crumbling. The marriage he had orchestrated to strengthen England's Protestant ties had turned into a national embarrassment. Henry wanted out, and he wanted it quickly. But divorce was no simple matter for a king. It had to be justified, approved, and delicately handled to avoid scandal. In secret, Henry's lawyers and bishops began building a case for annulment, arguing that the marriage was invalid because it had never been consummated. Anne of Cleves, meanwhile, remained calm and courteous, unaware at first of the full danger surrounding her. She had no reason to suspect that her marriage and perhaps her life hung in the balance. Henry stopped visiting her, and his affection turned to distant formality. When word finally reached her that the king sought to end their union, she was stunned. But unlike his previous wives, Anne did not protest, weep, or rage. She was practical and wise beyond her years. She knew Henry's temper and the fate of those who had defied him. Catherine of Aragon's heartbreak, Anne Boleyn's execution. Anne had no wish to meet a similar end. When officials came to question her about the marriage, she answered with grace and honesty. Yes, she said, the king had treated her honorably. No, the marriage had never been completed. She even expressed relief at the thought of peace rather than royal passion. Her calm acceptance softened Henry's anger immediately. He admired her humility, calling her my sister and declaring that she should be treated with kindness and respect. The annulment was granted swiftly, less than 6 months after their wedding. Anne lost her title as queen, but was given generous estates, money, and a lifelong pension. She was allowed to remain in England and even invited to court on special occasions. Henry spoke fondly of her afterward, saying she was a good woman, though not for him. The people pitied her at first, but soon they saw she had achieved something rare: freedom, wealth, and safety in a world where Henry's wives seldom survived his displeasure. As Cromwell was arrested and led to the Tower for his failure, Anne quietly settled into her new life. She had arrived as a bride, departed as a royal sister, and emerged as one who managed to leave Henry VIII's side, not in disgrace or blood, but in peace. In the years that followed her annulment, Anne of Cleves lived a life that few could have imagined: peaceful, secure, and surprisingly content. While other women had lost their crowns, their dignity, and even their lives to Henry's temper, Anne had managed to turn rejection into freedom. England came to see her not as a failed queen, but as a clever survivor. She took up residence in her grand country homes, Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, both gifted by the king,
and became a quiet but respected figure in the royal circle. Henry, perhaps out of guilt or genuine fondness, treated her with affection. He often referred to her as the king's sister, a unique title that kept her close to the royal family without the burdens of marriage. She was invited to court for important occasions, banquets, holidays, and family celebrations. When Henry married his fifth wife, the young and lively Catherine Howard, Anne was present, smiling graciously and wishing them well. Some courtiers whispered that she must feel bitter, but those who knew her said she bore no grudge. She had gained what so many others had lost: safety. In private, Anne seemed content with her quiet life. She learned to speak English fluently, dressed in the English fashion, and adapted gracefully to her new country. Though she had no children of her own, she was fond of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, often corresponding with them and sending them gifts. When Elizabeth later became queen, she would remember Anne with kindness, calling her a good and gentle woman. Anne of Cleves outlived all of Henry's other wives. When she died in 1557, she was buried with honor in Westminster Abbey, not far from the man who once cast her aside. Her story became a legend of its own, the tale of the wife who turned disappointment into victory, who kept her head and her freedom in a time when both were easily lost. The portrait that once deceived a king still hung in England's galleries, its painted beauty frozen in time. But Anne's true legacy was far greater. She was not the portrait of disappointment after all, but the quiet triumph of wisdom over vanity and grace over power.